We are going to go now to our third and final round. Each debater is given a brief amount of time, 2 minutes each, to make a closing statement. And we will begin against the motion, Ambassador Nicholas Burns, former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs.
Thank you. This has been a terrific debate, and I've enjoyed it very much. I like where Dan left off. The way to get serious draconian sanctions, the only way, in my experience and my judgment, is to continue this diplomatic process, is not to give up on it, is to bring the Russians and Chinese and Japanese and Arab countries in, the major trading partners, and to convince them to go along with us. I think we face a real threat in Iran, and we should be very tough-minded and very serious in facing it as Americans. And we should not leave military force out of this. We should leave that on the table. We should have the threat of sanctions hanging over the Iranians' heads. But if we give up now, I'm afraid we'll never know the answer to the question, was peace possible? Did we have the patience and ingenuity and the courage to believe in ourselves, to believe in our ability to be successful at the diplomatic table? I think we should lead with diplomacy, with the military in reverse. I'm afraid that if we agree with Liz and Dan's position, we're really leading with the military, and we're forsaking diplomacy. President Obama has just begun his administration. He's just begun this diplomatic process, which is going to be quite complex. It's not going to go on forever. He needs to be given time, and we need to have the patience as citizens to let diplomacy play itself out, not forever, but for, and I think everybody can agree on this, for several months' time to test the proposition that we might find peace and not find war. I think, frankly, that if we just tried war now and gave up on diplomacy and either emboldened the Israelis to strike or struck ourselves, which is the logical conclusion of this position of our opponents, I think it would be unconscionable of us to go to war, to start a third war, without having given diplomacy a chance. That's our position. I hope you agree with it.
Thank you, Nick Burns. And summarizing for the motion, diplomacy with Iran is going nowhere, Liz Cheney, former State Department official overseeing Mideast policy.
I would venture a guess that I'm somewhere to the right of many people in the audience tonight, with one or two notable exceptions. But you don't have to be as hawkish as I am on this issue to realize that our current diplomatic track with Iran is in fact going nowhere. You really only have to agree with the testimony that Nick gave before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week. In his testimony, Nick very helpfully laid out steps that the Obama administration must take in order for diplomacy to go somewhere. He said force must be on the table. President Obama needs to prevail upon Iran to freeze its nuclear research as the talks proceed so Iran does not steam ahead unimpeded. President Obama should set a timetable. And finally, Nick said, that it'll be crucial that the president agree on the automaticity of sanctions with the P5 countries, especially Russia and China, in advance of the talks. Now, I think we probably disagree on whether these steps alone are tough enough to convince the Iranians to give up their weapons, but it is indisputable that any of these steps are part of our current diplomacy. Therefore, as we debate the issue tonight and as you cast your vote, I would say don't be swayed by Nick's division of, vote for them and you're voting for war, and vote for us and you're voting for peace. What we're arguing is that the current diplomacy is ineffective, is going nowhere, because by Nick's own definition, it does not include the steps that it needs to include to make diplomacy effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz Cheney. And summarizing against the motion that diplomacy with Iran is going nowhere, Kenneth Pollack, Senior Fellow and Director of Research at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution.
I think there are two interesting things that are going on right here. In some ways, we're having two separate debates. On the one hand, I'm really heartened by what we've all agreed to over the course of the last hour and a half. I'm really struck by the fact that we all do believe that tough-minded diplomacy really is what this is all about. And Liz, while it may be useful in trying to win this debate, I would suggest to you that you and I both know Nick pretty well. He's not contradicting what he said before the Senate. He still believes it. He hasn't changed his mind over the weekend. And what we're saying is effectively the same thing. And so, at the one hand, I think that the differences between us may be a matter of semantics. As I suggested, it might be a matter of months. And I think that's actually really remarkable. And it's something worth taking away from this, is that we all are pretty close on this. And what we're defining as what the right policy is actually pretty close. At another level, though, of course, the question as posed, I think, raises a very different set of propositions in people's minds. And that's what Nick was trying to get at just a minute ago. And I think that it is important to think about. Because while I think that Liz and Dan have been very good about saying, look, we're not talking about going to war, rushing to war, jumping right into these things, and we want to give diplomacy a chance. It's just doing some things differently. And we would come back and say, you know, look, the Obama people have just started. It's not clear that these things aren't part of what they're doing. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest it will be. I mean, let's remember Hillary Clinton did talk about crippling sanctions against Iran, which was a very important point. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of other people out there who aren't on this panel who will say, look at that sentence and say, yeah, you're right, time to go to war, or time to go to regime change, or something else. And I think that's what we have to be concerned with. And those people don't seem to be represented on this panel. And as far as I'm concerned, in the wider debate, the one that isn't going to be scored tonight in the US public, that's the debate that we really have to focus on. Because diplomacy is the right way to handle things. It is the right way to start. If we don't start there, we're never going to end up anywhere that we want to be.
Thank you, Ken Pollack. And finally, summarizing for the motion, diplomacy with Iran is going nowhere, Dan Senor, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations.
I would just close with a couple of quick points. One is a quote that I'll read that characterized the Iranian leadership in March of 2007. President Ahmadinejad is reckless, he's irresponsible, and he's inattentive to the daily needs of the Iranian people. That was not Liz Cheney, that was not Dan Senor, that was then Senator Obama in a speech in Chicago on March 2nd of 2007. That characterization is probably accurate and is probably consistent with the history that Liz laid out at her opening. We don't know exactly what will push the buttons of the Iranian people, or what exactly, none of us truly know what will push the buttons of the Iranian regime. It is such an opaque society. You know, I went through this with Iraq when there were many experts on all sides of the ideological spectrum who had very strong views about how the Shiites would respond to this, and the Sunnis would respond to this, and the Kurds. And, you know, some of them, all of them, sometimes all of them were wrong, and sometimes all of them were right. And as Nick said earlier, when you're dealing with a society, for 3 decades we've had no communication, no interaction. It's very hard to know what's going on inside. So all we have to base this debate on is the history that we're aware of, which Liz went through in her opening statement, the actual public statements of the leadership of the country, which should count for something, and the rhetoric they have used with regard to Israel and the United States and the West is apocalyptic. And thirdly, their capabilities, the capability that they are trying to develop right now in defiance of UN Security Council resolutions and in defiance of our effort to reach out to them. That is a dangerous, toxic combination. Their history of non-negotiation and stalling, combined with the public statements about what they would do, the genocidal rhetoric they articulate, that they say they would use genocidal weapons for, and finally, the capability that they are trying to pursue. So,
Dan Senor, I'm sorry, your time is up. I'll give you 10 more seconds.
A diplomatic process is fine as long as we are clear and we can make clear to the Iranians where it ends and how strongly we back up the alternative course in our debate.